Hello everyone, my name is Aaron Christensen and this is Horror 101 with Dr. AC, a gathering place for fellow fiends the world over to discuss all things freaky and frightening. If you want to be part of the conversation, and I hope you do, I invite you to like this video, subscribe to the channel, maybe go back and check out some of our previous episodes, leave a comment, and most importantly, let us know the fright flicks you'd like to discuss in the future. That kind of connection is exactly what we're looking for, and it really does make a difference. We're all about sharing the scare, and we want to hear from you. When celebrated photographer Avery Crounse set out to make his feature film debut, he didn't opt for the simple route of an escaped psycho wielding a butcher knife like so many of his early 80s contemporaries. Eyes of Fire is instead an epic venture into the realm of magical realism, following a pair of families in 1750 on the run from their puritanical community's torches and pitchforks. As they escape into the wilds of the American frontier, they encounter not only justifiably hostile Native Americans defending their territory, but also tree demons and tortured spirits bent on taking their lives, stealing their souls, or worse. Crounse's visual eye is stunning, capturing the struggle between man and nature in bold relief, with breathtakingly beautiful tableaus, trading beats with ambitious and creative practical effects. Eyes of Fire is a testament to artistic vision realized on a tiny budget, and after years of obscurity, is thankfully enjoying a renewed wave of awareness thanks to its inclusion in Severin's outstanding folk horror box set, All the Haunts Be Ours, also available as a standalone Blu-ray, as well as streaming on Shudder. The secret is in the trees, and it's now revealed to a new generation of adventurous genre fans looking for something outside the proverbial box. I'm very excited to chat about this folk horror masterpiece, and I've got an awesome panel to chat about it with me, so I'm going to bring everybody in, and let's say hello to S.A. Bradley of Hellbent for Horror.
And thanks so much for having me on.
Aaron Abishan of Discover the Horror Podcast.
Thanks for having me. Can't wait to talk about witches.
John McDevitt of Facet Chicago.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
And frequent contributor to We Belong Dead, Alan Tromp, beaming in from St. Louis, Missouri.
Thanks, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. I dressed up for such august company.
And we're here to chat about Eyes of Fire from 1983. Thanks for coming on the show, everybody, and welcome. I remember coming across Eyes of Fire back in its VHS days. Certainly, I was not prepared for it then. I don't know if I'm prepared for it now, but I certainly have a different appreciation for it now. And of course, it's coming into a lot more people's consciousness thanks to that great box set that Severin put out, All the Haunts Be Ours. Alan, I'm going to go and start with you. Where did you come across Eyes of Fire for the first time?
Well, for me, it was the exact same place that you mentioned, that Vestron video. And I think I had read something that somebody said, this is a really unusual film. You should see it. I might have seen a trailer for it on another Vestron tape. But so I rented it and watched it for the first time. And honestly, the next time I watched it was on the folk horror set that Severin put out.
How about you, John?
The first time I heard about Eyes of Fire was when the Music Box was screening it as a part of Music Box of Horrors. And I remember they scheduled it in the wee hours of the morning. And I went home to get enough sleep to be well rested enough for Eyes of Fire. Only wound up getting about 4 hours of sleep, I think, and did drag myself back to the theater in time to see it because I was so intrigued by this film I hadn't heard of before. And it was as much a nightmarish and wonderful experience as you would hope it would be, just kind of watching it barely awake in the wee hours of the morning at the Music Box on 35 millimeter, no less.
That describes so many of my viewing experiences during that Music Box of Horrors. Like they just put on like the weirdest stuff in the middle of the night, I think, to try and keep you awake. I don't know that this is the film that's going to keep you awake, but if you are awake, that's like the perfect time to be seeing it because it's kind of that liminal space between consciousness and unconsciousness. Scott, how about you? Where did you come across Eyes of Fire?
Like a lot of people here, which makes me kind of happy, although I of course know that there's a few people here who are from Missouri, and maybe that's a reason why I'm surrounded by people who saw it back in that time period. But I saw it when I was in New Hampshire in the military, and there was this little mom and pop store, and they had it was one of those places where I don't think they necessarily were cineasts, but they knew to just throw everything on the wall and see what would stick. So they would get everything. And I saw a couple movies. There's a movie called The Passage, which I really love, from 1983. And nobody had ever seen it. Now it's been out from Vinegar Syndrome. And this one was there as well. And I saw the poster art for it, which I now know that the director made. I was going, that looks pretty damn cool. And it's interesting. I wonder how it would go over now if it had come out now, because it was such a weird idea to have a movie about the frontier in a horror movie, where at that moment everything was a little bit more 80s style. And so I got this thing and I watched it and I was going, I'm not necessarily sure I understand everything that's been going on here, but it really hit something that I liked, which was, at the time, I don't think people were using folk horror as a term,
Right.
but it was something that really resonated with, like, the Algernon Blackwood side of me. And so I was really enjoying this idea of nature being this whole thing. And it's one of those that I would use all the time when I would meet new horror guys and just see, does anybody know? Is this one of those that nobody else knows? And this is, I think when I first got to Wasteland, it was the first time I had one or two people who said, oh yeah, I've seen that. That's the one with the picture with all the skeleton arms coming at her. I said, yep, that's it.
You're like, I'm home. And Aaron, I recently listened to your episode on witches, where you attempted to, share your joy for Eyes of Fire with your co-hosts, to little avail. But I know that I was there with you.
It's true. Yeah, it was one of those things. So I said, I enjoy saying things that I then have to eat my words later on. But at one point, not that long ago, sometime in the last decade, I said to someone confidently, I'm pretty sure I saw every horror film that came out in the 1980s, which is an idiotic thing to say, but I said it. And this was one of those fun times that I got to eat my words, because there's a lot of movies that I remember the fact of them, but I don't remember anything about them. It's kind of how my memory works generally, and especially for a movie that came out 40 years ago or whatever. But I discovered, whenever I bought the Severin box set, that I had not seen this film. At least I didn't have any memory of seeing this film. And it just made me so happy. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before. It was one of those rare experiences. And I found out later more about the director, and I'm sure we'll talk about him. But those rare experiences where someone who isn't trained in the system and doesn't know how to be the kind of artist that they've chosen to become kind of nails it for me, and really explores some territory that I hadn't seen anybody explore before. And I found it delightful. I love this movie a whole lot, even with, some glaring witchy warts. I'm a big fan.
Again, we all kind of discovered this at different times. I'm curious to hear how it landed with folks, and then we'll kind of get into the nitty gritty. But I know when I watched it for the first time, I was watching something that first off, it didn't feel like a horror film, which is how it was pitched to me. And I was like, yes, there's some kind of fantasy elements, but the overall weirdness of it makes it completely appealing to that side of me. But in terms of the horror aspect, I was kind of like, well, I don't know if it's something I would pitch to other horror fans, or at least I would not have pitched it back then. Nowadays, like you, Aaron, I would probably sit down with somebody, or you, Scott, and sit down and say, hey, check this thing out. It's unlike anything you've seen before, because that seems to be what I traffic in these days more than anything. I'm like, I don't care if it actually scares me. I just want it to be something I haven't seen before.
When I first saw it on VHS, to tell you the truth, I wasn't paying that much attention to it. And that was difficult, because I was trying to figure out whose daughter is whose, and who's there are a lot of characters in this. You have to kind of keep track of them. Honestly, I really enjoyed it, and I very much like the subtle or not so subtle special effects that they had in it. But it really struck home with me when I watched it a couple days ago on the folk horror box set, just how excellent it was. I didn't watch the alternate version, the Cry Blue Sky. I'm curious to see how different that is. And I know the director said that he prefers that one, but this one made sense to me, and I thought, it had a pretty good pace to it, and I enjoyed it very much.
I mean, what director doesn't like their longer version of the movie they made? I haven't watched it. Scott, you were kind of nodding. Have you seen the Crying Blue Sky version?
Yes, I have. It's kind of like Possession, when Possession had the extended version, the director's cut, and you're like watching Possession in the theater at 80 some minutes, and you're going, there's obviously stuff missing. I'm missing something that gets its connective tissue. And you watch the long one, you go, nope. It's still got this thing. And that's kind of how this version of Eyes of Fire is, because there are some things that are definitely spelled out a little bit more. There's the madness of the priest at the end when he's left alone. That is extended, and so that's actually kind of scary. But for the most part, it's a lot more exposition, and that doesn't necessarily fill up the holes. I actually like it better with less, because you have to kind of figure it out. I think the director said a lot of people like it, because the shorter one, because it feels like it has this esoterica where you have to try and figure out the art of what's going on. So they make their own assumptions on it. And I think that's a fair assessment of why I like it.
For one thing, I'm a big fan of world building and lore, and I'm a fan of lore that doesn't feel like, I'm getting a log line of that lore. The lore feels baked into this film in so many different places. It feels like everybody sort of lives inside of this mythology that they've built in a really nice way. And so I liked that about it immensely from the word go. I think that culturally it's got a lot going for it, because it does have that sort of that moment when all the white people are like, haha, let's go down here into this valley because those Indians won't follow us, stupid, superstitious assholes. And then, of course, the Indians are standing up on the hill going, look at those idiots. They know what those people are walking into. So, it's got kind of a nice cultural conversation happening there that I think fits in our time. And then also, and as Alan mentioned, I think that the effects are so interesting. I've just never seen anything like it. The director is a photographer and used photographic techniques that he knew. And I've never been able to pronounce his name properly, so maybe somebody can help me out with that. But
I think it is Crounse.
Crounse?
It's pronounced like it sounds, because Stephen Thrower on that interview on that disc also has the same. He's like, am I saying this correctly? And he's like, yep, you got it.
So I really like what he brings to the table. And there's also some really great writing in this. I wrote down a line, she could make the flowers laugh. I just thought that was a great little line, So there's a bunch of different elements here that I like, and they all stack up to make something that I was very fond of. Overall, even though I do think, Dennis Lipscomb he chews some scenery sometimes. Sure, I can see that, but I think it's also motivated. So I got no problems with this film. I think everybody should see it because it fits my top shelf, which is to say, it's not like anything I've seen before.
I will say that revisiting it fully awake, it isn't as dark as I remember in terms of the atmosphere and the mood of the piece. It has, I think, a bit more of a lightness to it than I remembered. And that isn't to say that there aren't moments that are frightening and strange and horrifying. For much of its runtime, it is actually a really visually bright film. I kind of like what folks were saying about the question of, is this a horror film or is this not a horror film? I definitely think it stretches what a horror film can be.
Right.
And I really love films that do that. And I love kind of embracing films that blend horror with other genres, or that redefine the horror genre with the larger horror genre. The horror genre is something to be celebrated, and why not include this? And also, I love that this film is so inventive with its visuals, and I love that it presents laws of the supernatural that we don't see in many other horror films.
Mm-hmm.
It makes it far less predictable than many other films are, and keeps you riveted just trying to piece together how this world works and how magic in this universe works. And it just made it a really fascinating watch for me.
Was it you, Scott, that said the American frontier, the fact that it's set in the American frontier? I mean, again, we don't get that setting often in a horror film or a fantasy film. It's just, not something that we usually get. Much less in the 80s, like it's completely of its own time and flavor. And I think it's the kind of film that could only be made by somebody who's coming into it fresh and doesn't know what he can't do. Yeah. That's the thing I really, really like about it. The idea that, like we've got this strange fractured family that escapes their village for one reason or another. And we'll talk a little bit more about the specifics of the plot, but like this kind of like little weird family that is coming along, and there's these two ideas of male roles that is explored in a really interesting way. It doesn't feel like it's a sledgehammer, but it also feels very clearly defined in a very organic way. And I really enjoyed that. So let's talk a little bit about kind of like plot, characters, favorite moments, and things like that. And just so everybody's clear, we will be getting into some spoilers. So if you haven't seen the film already, please check it out. I believe it's streaming on Shudder as well, right? Yeah. So it's out there. And if you got that box set, you're going to get the extra bonus of the interviews and commentary and stuff like that. It's set in the American frontier, and I like that it's called the American frontier in 1750. We don't get an actual location; we just get that it's the wild.
You know, it's listed as on IMDb as a horror/western, which is incredibly wrong, and yet adjacent to being right.
Well, it is, and it isn't wrong. I mean, in a way, I mean, westerns are all about the unknown territory that's out there. And what I really liked about this, what was really tantalizing, was that it's the frontier, where we spend so much time with, even before we called it folk horror, of talking about the British, the Irish, the Scottish folklore of how dangerous it was back in the day. And there was this whole idea of, after you get past the Mississippi, you're in completely uncharted territory. Where, and I mentioned Algernon Blackwood earlier, and Algernon Blackwood, what inspired me about him was that he didn't make a separation between nature and supernatural. It was that if you walked far enough into the forest, physics suddenly just doesn't work. People suddenly become cats down this alley. Whatever it was would happen. And you get that kind of feeling. What I loved about this, you talked about, somebody mentioned the universe of the magic, or the world building. And it is a melange like the people who are on this trip. You got British, you've got Scottish, you've got Irish, you've got farmers, you've got people who are of the clergy, and they're going into this area, bringing their mysteries, bringing their superstitions, and the land seems to be reflecting that. And they're going into Shawnee country. And I thought it was really intriguing. One of the first most beautiful shots is them going down the river, and this British flag comes in, and it's on this raft that they're all on. And it was just this really pompous kind of welcome, right? It's you could see them being like Knights Templar coming in or something. And it was one of those things that was very telling to me, where they're getting attacked immediately, and the ruthlessness is shown, where they just put the guy's dead body on there, and they put little mannequins up, and they just keep him floating down. It's like you get an idea right then and there that this place is playing for keeps, that this is not going to be a nice nursery rhyme. And I love how all this stuff kind of combines. There's Irish changelings, there's Shawnee stuff, there's the idea of all the blood of anything that has ever died landing in this valley, very much like the opening lines to Naked Lunch, that America is this violent, ancient place that lives on blood. And so I thought there was a lot of really cool stuff, and the inventiveness of it. Like there's that whole moment where one of our main characters comes to kind of save the day, where there are trappers and there are Shawnee, and it looks like they're about to get into a rumble, and he comes dressed in this crazy witch doctor clown thing, right? And he's like, and my first thought is, oh, fuck, this is going to be like the natives in the lighter, and they're all going to call him a god or something. But it's not that. It's like they're laughing with him. Like he's just a nut job out in the wilderness, and they're humoring him. But they even kind of know him. Like, how's your wife? is the question that they ask each other. And to me, I thought that was so inventive and so interesting, and such a moment where you go, well, we're in a place where there are new rules. If you want to talk to somebody, put a gourd on your face and wear a hat and come spinning in. You don't come in and go, hello, neighbor. And I thought that was really intriguing.
We've got these characters, Marion Dalton, who's our kind of like trapper guy, and he's been out in the woods trapping like you do when you're a trapper. His wife, Eloise, takes up with this preacher, Will Smythe, because, you shouldn't be messing around with the clergy. They decide that everybody must hang And so the townspeople get together and they're going to string everybody up. And Leah, who is somebody that Smythe supposedly saved from being burned or kidnapped or whatever, but she uses her magic. That's the first we see her demonstrate her magic, and she breaks the rope, and Smythe comes down just as Smythe's allies come in with their guns, and they basically just pillage the village and take their stuff, go on the raft, cut the line to the ferry, and they go sailing down the river. Marion comes back from his trapping. The townspeople explain what's happened. Marion goes off to find them. And that's where this kind of fractured family comes along, because they are trying to survive out in the wild. And they discover this valley, which has cabins in it, but no one is living there. And therein the mystery lies. That what you were talking about, Scott, that idea of the blood of the victims coalescing in one place and making that place evil. On the commentary for the Blu-ray, it makes comparisons to Pet Sematary, Stephen King's Pet Sematary, that the ground was just bad. John, what do you think of this? I would say that what we see is that the reason the ground is bad is because of how the white people have come in and messed things up. There's a statement to be made there, but it's never explicitly made. And I kind of like that.
I think that absolutely is wrapped up in what I think is the intended meaning of the film. It might also be broader than that. It might just be all lives that were killed, all blood that was spilled, contributed to this growing evil that just was a part of the earth and generated this witch devil. The film, I think, has a lot of ambiguity as to what the various supernatural beings in the film are, what exactly the cause of this devil witch is. That's one of the reasons I love the film, is that it does, I think, maintain quite a lot of mystery through the very end. It just raises a lot of questions. It does make nature and the supernatural indistinguishable in this extremely mysterious way. And in a way that's super intrinsic to a lot of folk horror films and stories too. Yeah, but I saw it as very ambiguous and not tied to just one particular cause.
I agree with it now that we're talking about it. I'm trying to recall, though, in the film, the settlers find some old cabins that had been originally made by some people who came before.
Right.
And they find a tablet in a stream that explains those people, I think, wound up being killed. And it goes into what, talks a little bit about that. They say who killed them? And feel free to shut me down at any time, because I'm really going to let the nerd light shine now. Okay.
That's why you're here.
So it's very strange that we're talking about this movie now, because recently I read John Crowley's book, Big Little, which is a fantasy classic, basically about a sort of Bradburian little town. And the people in the town have made a deal with the fairies, the fairy world that lives there. So I'm reading about that and some of the things. And then I wind up getting this book at Half Price Books called The Vanishing People. And it was all about the fairy customs in England and Ireland and France. And there are so many parallels to the stuff that's going on about there. Scott talked about it, like where you have the changelings, which are fairy children that are left and replace, human children. The fairies sucking the milk out of the cow.
Yeah.
That's something. The creature that the trapper originally shows up. I don't know if he's supposed to be, maybe he's trying to make him think he's some sort of trickster Cocopelli thing when he first goes in there. And there is a lot in the stories about there are fairies that can be benevolent and help you, and the best thing they do is often they make you lucky. And remember the one the little girl says about the reverend, he's the luckiest person I ever saw. And of course he's taken as his ward the young Leah, very Irish, very red-haired, that sort of thing. And they even call her a fairy at one point.
Right.
There's also another thing that says if you give fairy clothes, and I think that in the Harry Potter books, don't the house elf Dobby, don't they give him clothes? And that means that he no longer has to be a servant or something. If you give them clothes, a lot of times they react to that and say, okay, I'm done here, and the luck goes away.
Mm.
So, but another thing is there are the good fairies. Sometimes they call them the Seelie Court. Then there are the absolutely malevolent fairies, the unseelie court, that have no use for people whatsoever. And maybe that's what, some of this witch creature is.
When we see the changeling through Leah's eyes, it's very clear that this is a dark spirit, no mistaking it.
Yeah, well, first I want to say I'm getting myself a malevolent fairy tattoo. Second, I think that one of the things that I love about this film so much, going back to the concept or talking about the characters, is the way the characters are presented. At the beginning, I feel like you're giving this almost mindless sort of religious clump of faceless, nameless Puritans, and you side with the Reverend in the very beginning scenes,
Mhm.
and then that character develops eventually to where you don't. There's this whole weird Beverly Hillbillies meets Agira, the Wrath of God kind of process that happens where you're taking this weird sort of Apocalypse Now boat trip, with these characters, and it does this thing narratively. There's this point when they say, so and so, I forget what the character's name was. He was the first to die. He's still alive.
Calvin,
Calvin, yeah, he's still sitting there, but he's like, he was the first to die, and you're like, well, narratively, that's a strange thing to do. You don't have anybody to root for a while, and then the guy that eventually becomes your hero-ish, he shows up, like Scott says, with a gourd on his head and horns on his face, kind of dancing around like a lunatic. And so it breaks so many of the rules that you expect out of a narrative over and over and over again. Ultimately, the quote unquote insane person is the hero of the story, really. So there's so much here that I like about how they present characters, and then they completely take the road less traveled as far as the narrative path with these characters over and over and over again. And I think that's brave, and I think it's what I really found myself attracted to.
Yeah, it was funny watching it this time. I thought of The Witch, the very beginning
yeah.
of the movie. I'm like going, oh, wow, that whole setup is still there. The ostracizing is for a different reason, exactly the opposite, kind of a flip coin reason. In The Witch, they weren't Puritan enough for that guy. He's like, we're going to go somewhere where it's even cleaner than these fuckers. And in this way, it's opposite. I really liked how, I don't know why he was so believable, but Guy Boyd as Marion, just immediately, as soon as I saw him, and I thought it was such a great moment where he's at the ferry crossing. He goes, "Where's the ferry? They stole it." "Who? Your wife." And his shoulders go down like, God damn it. And I thought that was such a great little thing, that there was this tension already, but it's this frontier world where, the things that they have run away from, they're kind of abandoning the idea of, well, I'm going to get a divorce or I'm going to stay with this guy forever. I did want to say that I'm going to have to do an Alan Trump here and be a little bit of a nerd. Huldefolk are the Icelandic and Scandinavian version of elves, which are sometimes also fairies, and they hide in the rocks. And there are no trees in Iceland. There's very few trees, but there are these huge areas of volcanic rock. And so when I went there, I was interviewing guys, and I interviewed a fisherman. And I said, so what do people think of the fairies and stuff? And he goes, well, 10% absolutely believe, 10% absolutely disbelieve, and 80% go, why tempt fate? And so there's this idea that, this is still a big part of their world. But when I talked to this guy, I said, what are the elves like? It was the Huldefolk. He goes, quite honestly, they're dicks. And I thought that was one of the greatest things to hear some guy talk about. So he was one of the people who was in that I don't hedge my bets. But it reminded me so much of the Huldefolk when they would be standing there and they'd have that weird rotoscopic effect where it would like change and they almost looked like they were made out of wood. And then they'd run, and while they're running, they would disappear. It wouldn't be like a quick pop. It'd be like this little fade off.
Yeah.
And so these native bodies, whatever they were, felt very much like hidden folk inside of the area. And I was going, damn, this movie's interesting because it mixes all this stuff together. Just a stew.
Well, it's interesting that like Dalton, who is this kind of, masculine character, like he doesn't come in and like, punch Smythe in the face and say, get away from my wife, I'm taking her back. Like he comes at it from a very interesting space where he's like, I need you to come back to me. I can't force you to come back to me, but he's willing to kind of hang out there and stay and give the opportunity for that to happen. He also recognizes that he has to care for his daughters, and he knows that this idiot isn't going to be able to do it.
Yeah, you've rarely seen a character in cinema that gets quite so firmly cuckolded and remains and just kind of hangs around it. He's like, well, that's what's going on. I guess I'm going to go watch him screw again because I have to go ask a question.
But yeah, the thing with Smythe, and I agree, Dennis Lipscomb, it's an interesting performance, but I kind of like his weakness because it works in a way that we don't buy this guy for a second. And yet that is so indicative of people in power, certainly people, this is hearkening back to the days of burning witches and things like that, where all it took was to be that person of authority and say that person's a witch. And that was that. And I do like, as he's going along, he still kind of has that power over them. And Dalton even comments on it. He's like, what is this sway that he has over them?
Well, and it's funny how they do such a good job of dismantling it for you. I don't know if everybody else shares my experience of it, but I felt like there was a sense that I might find my way back to this preacher, because when they first set him up, he's almost a daredevil. Like, you kind of want to like him in the beginning, and then he has this very gradual downfall. And I feel like they really build to that scene where they're picking seeds or they're planting seeds, and he's walking around not lifting a finger, and you're just like, I want to punch this guy in every part of his softness. Like, I want him to hurt, and I want to see it happen. And they do such a good job of developing him that way, that when that other scene comes finally where he's crying about his books being messed up, that's the thing that finally motivates him to have emotions about something other than like ho-hum, that you fully decided, I can't stand this guy. And they just build a really nice narrative arc for him, in my opinion. I can see why people think that he's a bit of an overactor in this, but it feels right for his character to me.
Yeah.
I think deterioration seems really authentic too in the final act of the film. You really see him falling apart at the seams in a way that I think is pretty convincing.
Yeah, and in the end, or in the longer version, you get to see that disintegration a little bit more. And I think it's one of those things where I'm not sure if the way that he acts in those sequences, if that's going to make people think his acting's better, or if it's more of the same. But it is really interesting. I think it's really cool what we're talking about here, because we have two characters who are men who are not quite what they seem when you first see them. They don't go in a traditional fashion, and neither do the women. Right. It's not like the women are there fawning over this guy. It's like, well, we have to get down the river and we have to take care of the kids. And my husband is a trapper, and fuck all, I don't know where he is. So we need somebody who's going to be able to take care of me. I love the moment where you think these characters, like when he's about to get hung, when Smythe's about to get hung, and he grabs the wife and kisses her before he gets up on the barrel. And I was like, oh, fuck me. All right. So he's going to be that kind of guy. And so in the end, though, we continue to see the women grabbing the kids, moving them in different places, but also carrying the guns for an awful long period of time in this movie. When they're leaving and they're leaving him behind, they're like the soldiers in Platoon. They are ready and they're going, and you're not going to get in their way. And I thought that was really interesting and indicative of what you would have to be like to survive in that frontier.
Less realistically, but along the lines of what you're saying in terms of just power dynamics of these characters, I think the most powerful character of all in the film is absolutely Leah.
Right.
She demonstrates time and again that she is the one who can save this group from all kinds of peril.
Well, and it's interesting, that relationship with Leah and Smythe. He tells us, spoiler coming, folks, he tells us that he saved her when they were, when they took the mother away. But then later he has that slip of when we were burning her mother, we had to keep relighting the pyre. And you're like, okay, what, like, how did that transpire then, that like Leah follows or stays with him? Why does he keep, is he just a collector of women as he goes? It's an interesting thing to ponder.
And it seems that Leah didn't know until he confessed that to another character in the film,
Right.
that he was partially responsible for the death of her mother. And I like that she immediately turns on him when discovering that about him. You just see on her face that this person who was an ally has become her enemy.
I think one of the things that's really cool about the movie too is it's a photographer, right? A still photographer
yeah.
making this film in motion. And there are just beautiful shots that I'm going, you know, you think about this movie you've never heard of. I don't know what the budget was. I didn't look up the budget, but it couldn't have been huge. And there's this really cool amount of time given to the stream, the trees, fog going through the place, and just weird things like her eating mud. Like she's just sitting there eating peat and stuff to, I don't know, strengthen her. And I'm like going, this is some crazy shit. When she's laying in the water, I still don't understand the scene where Marion is like by the stream, and all of a sudden she comes up, naked, kind of laughing. They both laugh at each other. And I'm like going, what? And then just cuts, right? But there's this whole thing of the visual beauty, which I think is another thing that really makes or breaks something that's folk horror. Nicholas Roeg would do it right. Peter Weir would do it right.
Terrence Malick, you know.
Yeah, Terrence Malick. I was thinking Blood on Satan's Claw.
Piers Haggard.
Thank you. Piers Haggard just died recently. Those guys really, you can smell the peat, right? You can smell the way things look is really strong. And those trees really worked out really well. And, you know, it's not even where we're at the witch yet, which is so fucking cool. And she's like sinking into the ground and like writhing, and holy fuck.
Yeah, I do made the movie.
Yeah, we have to talk about these visuals because, like, the faces in the trees, you know, the naked people suckling the cow, you know, like there's, and also, can I just say, like, there's a horse in a canoe at one point, and we just kind of take it. We're like, oh yeah, you know, he's got his horse in his canoe, and they're just rolling down the river. I'm like, okay, first off, that happened, that somebody put a horse in a canoe and that horse stood there long enough to float down and get that shot. Because I'm like, I would never think to put my horse in a canoe, but apparently that's what they did in the American frontier in 1750.
The visuals of this film, I agree with everyone that it is visually stunning, that the nature photography is sumptuous. It's really beautiful to watch. And it is a film that in some ways feels to me like a made-for-television film in terms of appearing to be made on a super low budget, in terms of having extremely primitive special effects, kind of making do with very limited resources and very limited tech. And it's something I really appreciate about it. And it sort of made me think just more broadly about the folk horror genre, about a lot of the television entries in the folk horror subgenre. I mean, its roots are very much in television. Some of my personal favorites being Children of the Stones.
Yes.
And I really love The Changes and The Owl Service, like a lot of the British television productions from the 60s, 70s, and 80s that kind of fall under that folk horror umbrella. Just the inventiveness with very few building blocks, with just very limited resources to just create strange visuals and just, I don't know, truly magnificent atmosphere that has as much an impact on the viewer as maybe a much bigger budget production. And the results, I think, are extraordinary. It's a really stunning film.
I completely agree with you. And part of it is the casting. Dennis Lipscomb is a guy that you saw on TV a lot. And when I saw Fran Ryan as sister, I was like, oh my God. She was like, if you grew up in the 70s, I feel like you saw her every time you turned on the TV. And I went and looked on IMDb, and I was right. She was in like every television show from night. She started in 1966 on Batman, and she was in every TV show I can remember ever seeing at one point or another.
Yep. Yeah. And she's so distinctive and memorable, and she's terrific in this film. Her softness and her shriekiness, I think, are both used extremely well.
I knew I'd seen her from somewhere, but and I watched the interview that they had with the director on there. He mentions that she was the woman in the Hungry Jack pancake commercial.
Yeah.
Which I nice. Remember. That was definitely one place I remember her from.
Yep.
Yeah. To jump on what John said, the thing that I really like about this movie is I think that if I remember, Crounse owned that land or rented that land. He had like this huge area of land that was in the woods in Missouri that he was shooting in. And what I love about this production is it seems like they never overreached. They looked around like great independent filmmakers. What do we got? And let's work with that. One of the best shots has to do with Fran Ryan, where she's hoeing the ground. And all of a sudden she hits this thing and blood squirts up and it's in a guy's throat and he comes up and she screams. I was like, that's brilliant. I mean, it's so simple and yet it really worked well. And then they're shooting bones at people and a bone goes into a guy's neck and he's like laying there like a carotid artery shot. And there's like skulls raining down on people. I'm going, that is fucking original. That was amazing.
What I like about the special effects is that I wrote down like it feels like a community theater, which is, by the way, my favorite kind of theater. Like I love watching people throw together a show, whether they're equipped or not. And we get invested because I think like we kind of like get on the film's wavelength. Like it takes its time to set up this world and here's who our performers are going to be. And they're going to talk like this and act like this. And then it starts delivering. Like the special effects start raining down on us and we go, I'm in it. You've cast your spell enough that I'm willing to meet you halfway. And I think that was so smart that it doesn't start with the magic. It lures us in and then starts to just introduce things to where we're absolutely on board. And we don't care if we can see that the flat, we can see the back of the flat. We're like, I don't care. I'm in this world now and I'm buying into it. And I really felt that this time around.
Yeah. That tree covered with white feathers, right?
Oh man. And again, so simple and yet so elegant.
I do think the simplicity of the production really strengthens it.
That one thing I really liked in there was, and just what you were talking about, it seems at times like people get and by the way, I should mention that is one of the nastiest looking witches that I've ever seen. She's just great.
And really, but really organic and really tactile. And it looks like, it looks like something somebody sat down and made in their shop and said, this'll work. And it works.
But I also liked in there that, okay, at some point, some of the people get sucked into the trees, like you said, and you see their faces protruding. And to get them out, you have to hit them with an axe. And maybe it's that thing about it's iron, it's smelted metal, technology versus nature, that sort of thing. But I also thought that was very good. There's also, just in terms of images, one thing that I also like, there's just a really brief scene in there where as they're plodding into the woods after they've had to abandon the river, there's this puddle filled with blue butterflies that just jump up out and, and like, how'd they get did they spray them that color or something? But it's a great little atmospheric shot.
Yeah, frog in the mouth of the witch.
Oh yeah,
that whole thing.
The head off of it.
Really, it felt like something Guillermo del Toro would come up with. It was just a really interesting. It feels like an ancient folk tale when that happens, and the idea that she's sleeping underneath this tree and they're hiding up in this tree, surrounded by their friends' faces. It's a fucked up moment.
Another thing I would just mention is just the title, where you get that thing about what are these spirits? Well, they're animals that got too close to the fire.
Yes.
And it's the eyes of animals reflecting back, cold eyes, but the rest of the body has been burned away. Just that hunger or that it remains.
Yeah. I really love that dialogue.
Yeah. The idea of the animal that is if it was wise, it would know that it would keep it warm, but also that if it got too close, it would burn it. We are not wise animals. And I think that's something, that's a commentary that's being made that, humans will inevitably always get too close to the fire. That final moment, again, spoilers, everybody. What do we think about the guard with his eyes of fire? Like, is that just a horror trope that's tacked on, or like what do we think of that final moment?
I did find it odd because I was they're in New France, right? Is that the name of the territory that they're in?
Yeah.
And so it's the French. They're wondering if they've been invaded. They find these kids. Talk about a cool idea. Kids floating on a river in a casket, right?
Yeah, for a week.
Yeah, for a week. And they pull them out and where are your parents? Funny, let me tell you this story. So it's interesting if those eyes are an infiltration, that it's not just this valley, that it's everywhere that the settlers are going, everywhere the colonialism is going. There's a changeling. Yeah, it's only a matter of time till your castles will also burn. And that's kind of what I got out of it. But it was a weird thing because it's taking the girls and putting them into terror again, or they're in harm's way, right?
I do think that that interpretation could be true. I think the opposite could also be true, that this is an infiltration of the guard, a possession of the guard to rescue these two young women. I think it's possible that it's Leah having maybe taken the power of the devil witch, having just absorbed her power and replacing that supernatural force in nature, now kind of using that additional power to rescue these friends.
Because we know Leah is still there because she gives her the flower.
Yeah.
You know, so we sense the presence of Leah. It's an interesting kind of end for the film, is that what does it mean? And again, it leans into that ambiguity, but
the music though seems to suggest that something malevolent just
yeah,
happened.
I was gonna say, that's definitely a horror sting.
Yeah, and it's that freeze frame, right? That goes all the way back to like Devil's Triangle in 1975. It's like,
Well, in Wikipedia says that, and this is their interpretation, that the eyes mean that this is a spirit that's under Leah's domination as the new Queen of the May or whatever she is, and that she will help the children. But I kind of got the impression that no, this is another shape-shifting monster that even has gone out into the French territory, and Leah's protection is still needed for the children.
I'd love to talk about Carleen Crockett as well. I mean, she doesn't do much after this, but I think she was on Dallas, and she was in the Dorothy Stratton thing, the TV movie. It's a weird performance. But she just has the right face for that kind of character. And she doesn't have a lot of lines, but she's really, really demonstrative and very strong in the scenes that she's in. It was weird when she did talk. I almost wished that she never talked, because in the end, there's a little bit too much exposition. If there's one thing that sometimes, I think Aaron mentioned it before, where they're talking about the one guy and he's like, he's the first to die. And you're like, what's happening? And it's kind of like you feel at times that the narration is there because they put the movie together and they're like going, wait, I don't know who this person is. Who is this? So it's interesting that the narrator is not someone that we see on screen very often. It's one of the girls. And she's also in places that, how does she know this to do the narration?
And one thing about that is, and this might be reading a little too much into it, and it could very well be, the story is told by little kids and a young woman. Now, kids are going to, they rely on fairy tales. They rely on legends, magic. Maybe that's not really what happened, but we've got some unreliable narrators here. Maybe they all got massacred or something, and and they made up this beautiful story to deal with the tragedy.
I don't think that's what happened, but I like that interpretation. I mean, I like the fact that it is told by, and I also like the fact that it's primarily told by Fanny, the elder of the two daughters. But when Fanny goes into her trance, her sister just instantly picks up the narration. She's fine with carrying the load while her sister is in stasis. But the actress you were talking about, that's our person who plays Leah, right, Scott?
Yes. I'm sorry.
That's
okay. Carleen Crockett, Leah.
I think she does a magnificent job with that role. She's so extraterrestrial. I mean, she really kind of appears to be this inhuman creature that is anthropomorphic. And I actually like the moments when she becomes lucid and she speaks in a way that's coherent for the viewer. There's something kind of unsettling about it. I see for the entirety of the film that she's a good aligned character. She's a character that I think many of the characters around her think is insane, like before they discover that she has real magic powers. Her demonstrating later in the film that she's actually quite wise, I think is, I don't know, it's a powerful moment.
This is a movie you're either going to, I guess at this point we've spoiled it enough that if you stuck around this long, you've seen it. But if you have to tell people why, I think we've been talking about it all throughout. It's the uniqueness of the film. It's the sense that you've not seen one of these before. And I wish that was more common. I think that you get more opportunities for people to do things like this if there's more opportunities to see things like this. So I feel like it's a good movie to watch just because there's not another Eyes of Fire in the world that I know of.
We don't have a whole lot of folk horror movies here, and we've got like Pumpkinhead is a good example of folk horror. The Legend of Hillbilly John, based on the writings of Manly Wade Wellman, who was that's almost all he wrote, were stories based on the mythology of the Appalachian Mountains. So I think this is a great addition to those, that we have few of those. And if nothing else, mostly shot in Missouri. So it's a good public relations piece for us. So don't worry about that, Josh Hawley people. Look how beautiful this place is. Come on down. We need your tourist dollars. Visit us. We've only had one or two other, horror movies. Delirium is the only one I can think
Right.
of, not in Missouri. So come on, folks, enjoy yourselves. We've got a wonderful state here.
My favorite folk horror film is, and probably always will be, Picnic at Hanging Rock. I absolutely adore it.
Yeah.
But Eyes of Fire is absolutely in my top 10, possibly even my top 5. I just find it completely captivating, utterly fascinating from start to finish. And deviating a bit from the folk horror topic, I'll just throw out their recommendation for another frontier-themed horror film that I really like and that I think is super underseen. Grim Prairie Tales.
Yeah.
The title is. It's a marvelous film that has an animated nightmare sequence. It has Brad Dourif and James Earl Jones in the cast. Very much worth seeing.
Take all your tourist dollars and go to Pennsylvania. No, I really like this movie a lot, and I think that its time is coming for movies like it. I think that there's the country mouse, city mouse kind of conflict is very much alive right now. I think the idea of concern about environment versus technology is there. And this movie does talk to that. And it talks to where we're going and isolation and what happens with families and religions overstepping their boundaries. So I think there's a lot of topical stuff. It has a very fairy tale feel. I think we're seeing more magical realism. So movies that fall into that territory, if you like that, this is really good.
Yeah. I think that, as horror fans, like, this is the kind of thing to embrace. All right. Well, thank you all so much. I really appreciate you coming on and chatting about this amazing little piece of cinema. And we'll have you on again very soon. Until next time, keep searching, keep exploring, and keep sharing the scare.